Good morning, everybody, or good evening, wherever you might be. Welcome to the Institute of International Economic Policy, located here in the Elliott School of International Affairs. The Institute serves as a catalyst for high-quality, multidisciplinary, and non-partisan research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization. The Institute research program helps develop effective policy options and academic analysis in a time of growing controversies about international economic integration. The Institute work also encompasses policy responses for those who face continued poverty and financial crisis, despite worldwide economic growth. India is a primary focus of IIEP's work, and today's event is part of our Envisioning India series. It's being done jointly with the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, where we are located today. So welcome everybody, to all of you who are here and all of you who are online. Today's event is a very special one. We have three extremely able speakers. I think you have their bibliographies. The topic for today's seminar is, why is India growing so fast but not creating enough jobs? Some people think it's not growing that fast, that they question some of the numbers on the growth itself. Others think it is growing fast, but it's the structural growth, structural features of the growth are such that they are not creating enough jobs. Others feel that actually a lot of work is being created and that it's not being counted as jobs. So it's a very hot topic for discussion, that one of the world's now fifth, likely to soon become the fourth largest economies, is actually showing substantial GDP growth by government numbers, but not creating enough jobs. So today we have three very distinguished speakers. We have Santosh Mehrotra. I consider him probably the best labor economist in India. He's now at the University of Bath and at the Labor Institute in Berlin, but he has held many distinguished positions, including Professor of Economics at JNU, where he also chaired a very prominent center on labor studies. And you can read the rest about him. There's so much there. And he's published so many interesting books as well, 13, I think, by the last count, and one is about to come to the press very soon. So we also have Dr. Gurcharan Das. He is, in my view, one of the best writers on economic issues that I have ever read on India. In my latest book, I quoted him, where he has this fabulous line, "India grows at night when the government is asleep." So he has also been head of Procter & Gamble in India, and also had very senior positions in Procter & Gamble worldwide. His books have been made into movies, and you can read all about them in his write-up. So welcome, Gurcharan. And then we have Soumya Kapoor Mehta, sorry, at the World Bank. She has also a very distinguished career, worked in Seva, worked in UNICEF, now at the World Bank, where she heads the Gender and Inclusive Unit for India. And she has participated in the writing of many important World Bank publications. So welcome to you, Soumya. So I'm going to first turn to Santosh. Santosh, you have the floor. And then we'll come to Dr. Gurcharan Das and to Soumya. So over to you, Santosh. Santosh will give us a good overview of what the issues are and then some of his solutions as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Ajay. Thank you to the Elliott School, and thank you to Kyle and George Washington University for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. I was coming here for the Center for Global Development Conference, which starts later today, and I'm really delighted to be part of your Envisioning India series. So let me get this off the ground. India is growing fast, yes and no, as you can see from this title. It's growing fast relative to the past, but it needs to grow much faster at the rate of 8% per annum for at least 20 years to avoid the middle income trap, which I believe rightly the WDR, the World Bank's WDR of 2024, has pointed to, and India is one of the case examples that the WDR speaks about. I should give you very briefly the history of India's growth rate over the last 75 years. Between 1950 and 80, the growth rate was barely 3.5% per annum. We were a low-income country, low savings, low investment rate. So obviously we were growing at 3.5% per annum. There were some policy mistakes. However, many of those policy mistakes were indeed corrected in the 80s, and they were corrected further from the 1991 economic reforms onwards. So the growth rate had perked up by 2 percentage points to about 5.5% in the 80s, and then grew to 6.5% in the 90s. However, after that, it really rose really rapidly as the demographic dividend kicked in. India was at the peak of its demographic dividend, a subject I will come back to because it's relevant to the jobs issue. Because how is the dividend defined? The dividend is defined as that period in the life of a nation when the share of the working age population is rising, the share of the dependent population, i.e. the under 15s and the over 60s is dropping. And because the share of the working age population is increasing, they have to get jobs. If they don't get jobs, incomes don't rise. If incomes don't rise, because they normally simultaneously move from agriculture to industry and services, when incomes rise, if jobs rise, savings rise, investment rises, GDP growth rate rises. So the point here is that at the turn of this century, the growth rate had rose sharply because the savings rate rose and the investment rate rose, as I will speak about. India grew actually between 2004 and 14 at 7.8% per annum, which for a precocious democracy like India is, unlike China, it was pretty good. But over the last 10 years, from 14 to 24, unfortunately, the growth rate has dropped by 2 percentage points to 5.8%. It is certainly the fastest growing large economy indeed in the world, but only for the last 3 years. I mean, it was the second fastest growing large economy even before that. And let's remember the growth, the world itself has slowed in its GDP growth rate. Now, it's true that the fast recovery has taken place post-COVID, but let's also remember that our base was low. Our base was low in the following sense that we are the only low middle income country in the G20. All the other countries are either upper middle income or they are high income. And in fact, in the first year of COVID, our contraction was twice as high. It was at 5.8% as the global economy's contraction. So that was another dimension of the base effect. And that was primarily on account of policy mistakes, which I will refer to in a minute. And I have to say to you from this point onwards that no credible international agency, not World Bank, not IMF, OECD, none of them projects India will grow at more than 6.5% in this decade to the 2030s. Even when I'm saying, I mean, our estimates suggest that it needs to grow at 8%. If for 20 to 25 years, if it has to become a high income country and to escape the middle income trap. And as I'm saying, it was already the second fastest growing large economy. And the point is, it's still only at $2,800 per capita. It's only an LMIC. Now, finally, why is this this growth rate that is being claimed for the last 2-3 years of 8% by the government, questionable. It is questionable for a variety of reasons. The most important one is the first one, which is the organized sector question versus the unorganized sector. We have a very, very large economy. The vast majority of our workforce is in the unorganized or the informal sector. The unorganized sector's contribution to GDP is very significant. And yet, GVA or gross value added in that is not very well estimated because we don't have the capacity to collect data. About 66 million unorganized sector enterprises, 66 million. That's not even the population of many countries. We have 66 million unorganized enterprises. Now, what has happened is that the organized sector is certainly growing fast. And the way the GDP is estimated, this is a foundational problem. The way the GDP is estimated, the Central Statistical Organization uses for a particular sector, let's assume textiles, it takes the GVA for the organized sector, and for the unorganized sector, for the segment of the same sector, meaning say textiles, it projects the organized sector growth rate onto the unorganized. Now, if the unorganized is very significant, the share is very significant, then we have to begin to question that. There are deflator questions. Private final consumption expenditure is growing at half the rate of GDP. That's another question. And it's very highly questionable that in 16-17, the GDP grew at 8.3% despite demonetization, which devastated the unorganized sector, and the unorganized sector, as I said, has since then been doing much worse. That's really the bottom line. And since then, it has continued. And this has been proven by the most recent NSS. So yes, India will get to the UMIC status, but is likely to hit the middle income trap, like all large UMICs have done, South Africa, Brazil. And the WDR says that of 34 countries that have become high-income countries in the last 30 years, they have a total population of less than 30. Less than, all to get those 34 have a population less than India taken to. So, and those 34 have benefited from special circumstances, and that's not a situation that prevails in India. Above all, inequality of wealth and income has been growing very rapidly. And this is proven by work done by Piketty, Chancellor, etc., over the last 100 years, and I could talk about that. India is now more unequal than 100 years ago. That means the market size is not growing, demand is not growing, a subject that is connected to jobs, and I'm moving on. So this is directly now, bringing me to the job story. So while, yes, the numbers seem to suggest that the GDP is growing fast, but the economy, in any case, as Ajay rightly pointed out, is not generating as many jobs as we need to, because we are in the middle, towards the end of our demographic dividend. Our dividend runs out in 15 years by 2040, as I will show. And we just can't, we're not being able to generate enough jobs. And the economy is actually slowing down.
Santosh, if you can just pause there for one moment. We need to fix an issue with the slides, and then we'll ask you to begin.
So, the policy-induced shocks, demonetization, the 6 months later, the introduction of a nationwide goods and services tax, that had a very severe adverse impact on the unorganized sector, and that slowed down the unorganized sector, while those two policy shocks did not lead to a organized sector shock, but those two sectors were deeply impacted, so the economy did begin to slow down. And the worst big shock came after COVID, when the lockdown was national in scope, unnecessarily long drawn out, unnecessarily strict, and the result was deep depression, and we contracted very severely. So these are the combined reasons that have led to our growth rate falling from the average over a 10-year period of 2004 to 14 of nearly 8% to now 5.8%. It's deep enough to be structural. This is what I'm suggesting. I'm moving on.
Just wait, I think they need to fix the slides.
It's been fixed.
But yeah, it's moving. So what are the drivers of growth? Let's look at the 4 drivers of growth and see how they've been impacted by the shocks and why we can claim that actually these numbers of 8% now growth rate are questionable. First of all, I mean, I've already mentioned several, and now you can see the 4 drivers of growth themselves have been impacted. First, of course, the big driver, private final consumption expenditure, which accounts for about 60% of GDP. It's being maintained by cuts in household savings. Households have, because jobs are not there, real wages are not increasing, as I will demonstrate in a minute. You've seen household savings, which used to be sort of in the middle of the decade, around 24% of GDP, they shrank to 17% of GDP. As further on, I mean, they've risen recently, but at the cost of retail debts rising. So the point here is that the inequality is already showing up in the fact that the upper middle income, the upper classes, their consumption is fine. That's what the data is suggesting. However, they can't sustain the overall private final consumption expenditure, and because job growth is low, real wages are not rising, overall consumption growth has been much slower, and the unorganized sector has barely recovered. So what we've had a recovery, but it's a K-shaped recovery. Moving rapidly, investment rate is now lower. Over the last 8-10 years, the investment rate has never risen above 31% of GDP, when in fact in the preceding period it was between 31 and 38% of GDP. Exports, they have grown much slower, especially merchandise exports, although slightly offset in recent years by services exports. And finally, under the circumstances, it's not surprising that government, it's not the tax revenue to GDP ratio has risen. It remains the same as it has over the last 30 years, and yet expenditures have risen because the government is spending a lot now on freebies. So where is the fiscal space? All of the 4 drivers are not allowing growth rate to remain. Now, final point about this growth, and one element of the story is just that we're the fastest growing large economy of the world because there's a new India economy that has emerged, which is sort of driven by 2 high-tech goods and services sectors, mobile handsets, pharma, auto, and IT services. And then India has become a major hub of global capability centers. India is no more a software services provider or a giant call center. We are sort of providing all kinds of, ed tech, fintech, food tech, etc., and foreign capital is flowing. Now, all of this is still leading to a growth rate of 6.5%, and 6.5% is not generating the jobs. And the narrative, the government's narrative itself says that it's not going to be enough. The new economy or the new India economy cannot regenerate the old economy, which is 85% of the economy. Final part of my presentation, which I'll finish in 3 minutes, which you will see, there's been structural change as a result of all of this, that the economy has slowed relative to the past. Manufacturing output share in total GVA has actually been declining, as you will see this from 2012 all the way to 2022. It was consistently 17%. It has, in the last 8 or 10 years, fallen to 15.5%. So manufacturing is declining, as opposed to the narrative about Make in India. Next, the number of workers in agriculture has increased. That means there's a reversal of the process of structural change that was taking place. A massive reversal in the process of structural change with a shift into agriculture, I mean, since 2020. Since 2004, when we had begun to grow really fast, for the first time in India's history, we were pulling workers out of agriculture. The absolute number of workers in agriculture fell for the first time in India's history. A true Lewisian transition was taking place. That process continued till 2019. In the last 4 years, we've seen a massive increase and reversal away from industry and services back to agriculture with an addition of 80 million workers to agriculture, a rise in the share of agriculture, which contributes barely 15% of GDP. Even in 23-24, the latest data is suggesting there's an increase in the number of workers in agriculture by 20 million. And that is, it's showing here in this graph. By contrast, that number was dropping earlier, manufacturing was growing, and that process has been reversed. Why should all this worry us? It should worry us because you look at this graph, look at the center line, which is the projected working age population all the way from now to 2041 and 2070. Notice that it rises only until 2041. After 41, which is literally 15 years away from now, it will drop. In other words, the working age share of the population in the country will drop, and the aging share of the population is going to share of the population. Absolute numbers of the aged is already rising. Last point about this, we have to remember that the most recent estimate of the age distribution of the working age is the following. Half of our current working age, we're supposed to be a very young country, fine. We have our dividend, fine. But half of our working age population is above the age of 45. That means in 15 years, by 2040, there'll be a retirement of past. And they're all informal workers. 90% of our workers are informal without any social insurance. And then from 40 onwards, the share of the working age population grows. Our dividend is running out, our growth rate is falling, we've reversed the structural change, our growth rate is slowing. So who are the people we've got to provide jobs for? For the following. There are 4 groups. One, the young who are joining. 6 million are entering the labor force each year. Girls are a huge number and they are all getting better educated. This is, so that's the first is the flow. Now we got the stock. We got far too many. We already had too many people in agriculture. We've added 80 million in the last 4 years. Next, we had, there's the stock of unemployed. In 2012, we had only 10 million unemployed. In 19, it was 30 million. The number has not gone down. And finally, in the 4th group, there is a large number of youth not in education, employment, or training who are not even looking for work. They are able to work. They are willing to work. That's how you define needs. But they're not actually looking. They're willing, but they're not looking for work. So they're not in the labor force. That's why, and in that, there's been a doubling from 51 million to about over 100 million. So clearly a view that has been put out by government economists that, we need only 7 million jobs per annum is completely wrong. It's 10 to 12 million. And shockingly, the young who are joining, they have become unpaid family labor. They're saying we are in agriculture because they're doing nothing other than agriculture. When the enumerator comes, they ask him, what are you doing? I work in agriculture. They have to save face because there aren't jobs, even though they're educated. And this is actually shown by this. And you can see this further, that there's been an increase of youth in agriculture. That's the opposite of what they want to do because they are well educated. They're much better educated in the last 20 years. The numbers are actually systematically rising. Because this is showing in every sector how youth numbers have risen, particularly since about 2017-18. Youth unemployed. Look at this number. In 2012, there were only 9 million. They were already 25 million after that. So the unemployment rate of youth had tripled from 6% in 2012 to 18% in 2018. It has fallen since then, but that's only because they're saying we are in agriculture. And in agriculture, they're just doing unpaid family labor. So this is a totally tragic situation. And I mean, I can talk about this, but let me stop here because there's a whole growth strategy which we need to adopt, which we have not adopted.
Yeah, take another 3 minutes.
If I may.
Yeah.
So I'll just take 3 minutes over 3 slides
Yeah.
and no more than that. I mean, let's just remember that the growth rate in agriculture in our country has not been more than 3.2% per annum in any decade since planning began in 1950. Contrast that to Southeast Asia, East Asia, look at Ashwini Singh's work. They grew between 1950 and 1988, 6% agriculture did. That's how, surpluses were created, jobs, people could transition out of agriculture, and demand was there in the agriculture sector for manufactured goods. And this is very important today because consumption expenditure growth in rural India has been low, as something I pointed out earlier. And if government was to invest in agriculture at this stage, it is critical, and that's what's going to raise the growth rate, not necessarily simply raising the minimum support price for 2 products. But the government has been primarily allocating funds to agriculture through subsidies and cash transfers for farmers and at the expense of public investment to boost productivity. I mean, if we invested and productivity rose, incomes rose in agriculture, it would create demand for manufacturing because agriculture produces wage goods and it generates thereby, rural non-farm jobs. Final slide, creating jobs for you. What we need is a manufacturing strategy, an industrial strategy. We haven't had an industrial policy for 30 years, and we need a horizontal industrial policy, and I'll be very brief about this. Unlike East Asian success story, India has not had an industrial policy since its economic reform began in 1991. This is no longer tenable. Make in India, that talk of performance-linked incentive is just not good enough to achieve that objective because it is too vertical, it is confined to capital-intensive sector. India's manufacturing strategy should be cross-sectoral, horizontal, rather than products-based. Which is the approach of the current government, which is picking winners, which is the opposite of what the East Asian strategy was. They decided on 14 capital-intensive sectors to subsidize a subject I'll come to in a second, and those are being picked by the government bureaucrats. In many ways, that speaks for sort of harks back to the license permit route till the 1990s. Next, we have to allow the rupee we've allowed the rupee to appreciate against the dollar. And our exports have become uncompetitive. We have to allow the real effective exchange rate to actually depreciate. That's what is going to allow our exports to grow. Our exports grew at a rate of 15 to 18% from 1992 to 2014. That was primarily because, of course, there was an increase in investment, but at the same time, more importantly, the real effective exchange rate was at 100, index base year 1992. In the last 10 years, real effective exchange rate has actually appreciated, which has resulted in what I was saying earlier, that merchandise exports particularly have not increased. We have to also approach labor-intensive manufacturing sectors differently. Labor-intensive manufacturing, we have a comparative advantage. 50% of jobs in manufacturing are in garments, textiles, food processing, leather, and footwear. They have suffered because the unorganized sector has suffered because of the policy-induced shocks. We need packages now for those sectors. Next, most of this unorganized sector has MSMEs. They need much better support through a cluster development program. We have a CDP. CDPs have proven to be very successful in China, in the industrialization of another late industrializer, Italy. But in our country, the program remains weak. I can talk about what ways they are weak. Of course, we've had our young are much better educated. The mean years of schooling has risen very significantly. And we are in a position because of China Plus One to actually get much more FDI to enable export-oriented, labor-intensive manufacturing. We have not yet got our policies right to ensure that to happen. And, last two bullets, a continental country, our landlocked states, they still lack an industrial base, especially the northern states. So we are building industrial corridors, which is a very good thing, with industrial hubs. But the industrial hubs and the industrial corridors are mostly currently not in the north. They are fairly advanced, but the southern ones, there are 3 of them coming up, but they are growing, they're doing rather poorly. And finally, like the WDR 24 argues, we need to become a country which develops R&D capacity. We are spending barely 0.7% to GDP on R&D as a country. Firstly, China spends over 2%, Korea 4%. I mean, if India can land spacecraft on the moon, launch thousands of satellites, and attract over 800 international firms to establish global capability centers, it can certainly mobilize the professionals to foster its product and process design capacity. We need to build, invest in design capacity as well as increase our R&D. That's the only way we can become an innovative country, because while manufacturing share of GDP has historically been stuck at 15%, if we don't innovate, we can't grow faster and improve productivity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Santosh. Thank you for that fantastic overview. There's also in the last budget the employment-linked incentive scheme, but we'll come to that maybe in the Q&A. Let me now turn to Gurcharan Das. He's as I've already introduced him, but the perspective on coming now from the practical experience that he has. He's been studying India, but he's got very practical experience running business in India. So particularly on this issue of services and manufacturing, we'd love to hear from you, Gurcharan. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Santosh has given you a macro picture, and I must confess he's left you in a bit of gloom. I think my job also is to see a little bit of the glass of water that's half full. And what I will do is present you a granular case study to show how India can create jobs. And the question, of course, is whether we can replicate this success story in all our labor-intensive sectors. Clearly, jobs is an issue, and it came out in the last election, the national election. We had the Lok Sabha election a few months ago. And the fact is, yes, India is not creating enough jobs. Our labor surveys, periodic labor surveys, do not reflect this problem as starkly because of the fact that people in India are never unemployed. They're underemployed. That although our growth rate since 1991 has been close to 6%, and India has done well in services, becoming the world's back office, but it has not created an industrial revolution. Industrial success has eluded us manufacturing is still less than 15% of GDP, employing 11% of the population, and our manufactured exports, sorry about this again, our manufactured exports are less than 2% of global exports. Now, we know that no country has risen historically without manufacturing, nor achieved success without exports. The Asian tigers rose by exporting labor-intensive manufactures. China is the latest example. The good news that I want to talk about is that in recent years, very recently, a global brand, Apple's iPhone, has recently chosen India as its second manufacturing location. Its rapid success busts some dearly held myths among Indian policymakers, and it is a call to action. The iPhone was made entirely in China until 2021, and in these few years, it has already created 150,000 direct jobs in India, 70% of which are by women. Plus, it has created an estimated 450,000 indirect jobs while producing phones worth 14 billion US dollars and exporting 10 billion of dollars worth of these phones. This is only 14% of iPhone 16's global production, but it is expected to rise from 26 to 30%. It is expected to rise, as I said, at 26 to 30% by 2026. Meanwhile, these production sites, the Foxconn factory in Tamil Nadu, is employing 45,000 people, and they're building dormitories for women, which are near the factory. So this is something quite new that's happening. To become a viable exporting hub, India still needs to attract iPhone's component makers, who represent 85% of the value added. These are mostly Chinese. They will add far more jobs, impart more skills, and transfer more technology. Only thus will our MSMEs get linked to global value chains. This is how it happened in the case of Maruti Suzuki many years ago, that to become a really viable exporting hub and get the full benefit of the jobs that can be created, India still needs to attract the component makers who are all Chinese. Now, this is creating a bit of a headache for India. And everybody understands they will impart more skills, transfer of technology will take place, and thus will our small MSMEs get linked to the global value chains. Making components in India will also reduce our trade deficit with China. Thus, it is in India's national interest to allow in Chinese ancillaries. Otherwise, every mobile phone sold in India will continue to create a job in China. This story offers many lessons. The first It sheds the false myth that India is a big market. India has a big population whose purchasing power is modest. The fact is that global brand leaders are not queuing up to make in India. Apple phone sales in India were only 0.5% of global sales when it chose to make India a supply source as a hedge against China. Many global brands are also seeking to diversify, as we know, from their supply base from China. But India has not been their top choice because it has traditionally had a poor image as a manufacturing base. A second lesson is that no country can create enough jobs with its domestic market. China, with a far bigger market, needed exports to succeed. Export success requires joining global value chains, which represent 70% of the $24 trillion world trade in goods. This will only be possible if India drops its tariffs to competitive levels. Today, India's tariffs are amongst the highest in the world, and every production-linked incentive scheme should have a sunset clause on high tariffs. Third, the third lesson, the prime mover in creating jobs are not the small companies, MSMEs, but the big companies to which smaller companies become suppliers. Yes, small companies in the aggregate create far more jobs, but the action must begin at the top. The government should target global brand leaders like Apple phone, especially those companies who are concerned about risks in China. Small companies in the aggregate create far more jobs, but the action must begin at the top, and therefore government must target brand leaders. Now, the fourth lesson is the global brand leader doesn't have to be an Indian company. Once global brand leaders come, they will carry Indian companies to the world market via their supply chain. Tata's role in the iPhone story is a case in point. To succeed in the global market, you need superior products. Since Indian companies have risen behind tariff walls, they have not learned to invest on R&D to create those superior products. Hence, the absence of Indian global brand names. To create a jobs revolution, India's first step must be to woo world brands in the labor-intensive sectors. Fifth lesson, India needs a skilled population, but I feel sometimes we place the cart before the horse. Most women working in the iPhone assembly factories needed only 4 to 6 weeks training, even when it was their first job. Our training institutes like ITI and skills missions need to be much closer integrated with industry. The apprenticeship and internships, which were talked about now, which we are doing something about, particularly in the government's last budget, they are the right ways to go because on-the-job training is the best kind of training. Sixth, the iPhone 16 story shows also the right way to implement the PLI, the Production Linked Incentive Scheme. India has obvious cost disabilities versus China, Vietnam, and other competitors. PLI is not a general subsidy to industry, which is what the opposition has been screaming, but it is to neutralize quantifiable disadvantages of India's higher land, labor, and energy costs. Our PLIs should encourage exports, but they can't do so immediately. They can't do so blatantly without breaking the WTO rules. The smartphone PLI set high enough production targets that they could only be achieved through exports. Finally, a trust-building dialogue between government and company is crucial to success. It took 15 months of patient negotiations by open-minded teams on both sides who left their egos outside the door and listened to each other with refreshing humility. So in closing, let me just say that the iPhone story has sent a powerful signal to global companies that India can be a viable destination for manufacturing. It is now up to the government to replicate this success in all the labor-intensive sectors in garments, shoes, toys, food processing, and certainly electronic products. But the government has to be proactive. The Prime Minister of Vietnam actually showed up at Cupertino, California, Apple's headquarters, to persuade it to make iPads in his country, and he succeeded when he realized that Vietnam had lost the iPhone to India. China insistently woos foreign companies, but India's rulers are not trained to do this. Only a handful of Indian states even understand, and they understand the importance of doing this, and they are mostly in the south and the west of the country. Tamil Nadu is one of them, and it understands the role also of manufacturing clusters that Santosh mentioned. Tamil Nadu already has got an automobile cluster and is now creating one in electronics. But the central government needs to modify its electronic manufacturing policy, which limits clusters only to 2.5 square kilometers. Compare that to Shenzhen, which has 2,000 square kilometers in its cluster. So you need size in order to co-locate buyers and suppliers and get the benefits of shared infrastructure, such as shared testing facilities, effluent plants, etc. Anyway, there is, as I said, good news, and certainly Tamil Nadu's chief minister was unusual because he showed up a few weeks ago at the Ford to meet the CEO of Ford in America to ask him to restart the factory that they had closed because they hadn't got much market share. But he said, sell these cars for export. And that's exactly what they are doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gurcharan. Thank you so much for giving us this somewhat more positive picture. You have rightly emphasized that without services alone will not do it for us. That I think Santosh also said that manufacturing is critical, and this premature deindustrialization has to be reversed. So I'm glad. Thank you for that. And you also mentioned that the iPhone has started to employ some 40,000 women. And I think the biggest challenge...
It's 100,000 women.
100,000. The biggest challenge, of course, is that it's not, there's a bleak employment picture more generally, but particularly for women, and not just in employment, but in many areas, gender discrimination is a huge, huge issue. So let me now turn to Soumya. Soumya, you are the expert on this, with so much experience behind you, with SEVA, with UNICEF, and now with the World Bank. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ajay, for inviting me. I'm very excited to join the panel with Professor Mehrotra and with Mr. Das. I'll just try and tell you a story about women's employment in India. I don't have any slides, but as one of my professors in Cambridge, incidentally, Amartya Sen, who taught me maths with doubt any said, just imagine when I'm telling you a story, an equation is also a story. So I'll just tell a story, as I was saying, about female employment in India. And it started in about 2004-05, where there was a lot of discussion around the decline in female employment. In 1999, at the close of the last century, female employment in India actually was quite high. It was about 50%. Am I audible now?
Yes, very audible. Thank you.
Okay. So in 1999, female employment in India was about 50%, which is pretty high. And all this hue and cry about, well, only 25, 27% working women in India only began in about 2014-15, and the decline started in 2004-05. So what was going on? And most feminist economists and other people who have studied this paradox called it a paradox because actually women were more educated. They were also bearing lesser children, fewer children around after the 21st century. And they were also more aspirational. So why is it that, few women were getting jobs in a period where Professor Mehrotra rightly said that there was a lot of growth? So one particular explanation that's given is, well, India wasn't measuring its workforce, women's participation correctly. And that is possible because women do a lot of unpaid work as household helpers in enterprises, helping their husbands in shops, or they may be, tending to livestock. And it's all productive work, but it's unpaid. So because it's unpaid, it doesn't get counted. Now, ever since India started measuring its labor force participation quite regularly from the periodic labor force data in 2017-18, there was debate on whether we should start capturing that. And in 2021-22, there was a decision that we should capture unpaid work. So just about 2 weeks ago, you would see data that has been released by the Periodic Labor Force Survey, and the female labor force participation in India is back at about 42%. But that is counting a lot of unpaid work that women do as household helpers. It also doesn't take away from the fact that when this counting was not being done in 1999, it was still 50%. So where is it that we are going wrong, and why is it that women are not finding paid work? The second explanation then follows is whether women are actually able to supply their labor. Now, there have been 2 or 3 shifts. The first is that increasingly as families have become nuclear, and as opportunities are being created in urban areas where women's employment in India was traditionally very low at about 8 to 9%, it's very difficult for women to find jobs or to be available for jobs for the reason that they don't have any childcare support. And India's never really done well on providing creches. There have been Anganwadis in rural areas, but they were taken as nutrition or feeding centers, but nothing for, infants like 0 to 3 who are not even kept at Anganwadis in rural areas. So in urban areas, when a woman shifts with her husband as a migrant labor, where does she really leave her child? And even when she has no family support. So that is one big challenge that started coming up. The second challenge, even though opportunities were being created in urban areas, they were in very, very informal, precarious kind of jobs, including, say, in sectors like construction, which witnessed a certain growth, even though agriculture declined. And the third problem was that because, you're in urban areas, the perception, even though, of course, safety statistics have only worsened over time, the perception of the lack thereof has actually been a huge deterrent in allowing women to work. So even though women may be educated, they may be having fewer children, combined all of these factors, it's very difficult to offer, my labor to anyone if my husband's income is supporting me to stay at home. And that was also what was happening in terms of income effects kicking in. But on the demand side, and this is where I would like to refer to what Professor Mehrotra was saying, he's absolutely correct. If you see his graph, where he showed how the agriculture sector and employment in the agriculture sector, and there's been a rebound, but there was a decline between 2004-5 and 2018 in employment in the agriculture sector. Traditionally, women's employment in India has always moved with how employment moves in the agriculture sector. That is because agriculture, particularly because it's an opportunity, it's a work opportunity that is close to their homes. It allows them to manage household work, it allows them to manage their kids, and that's something that wasn't available during that period. So on the positive side, as Mr. Das said, what is it that we can do? I think the first, I had this recommendation again at the top of my list, which was that we should, of course, start looking at a manufacturing policy for India. That's where women need to shift, for the reason that there is another movement that's undergoing. A lot of women in India are now secondary educated. They are not as uneducated as their mothers were, and agriculture is not an occupation that they want to be in. But whatever industrial or manufacturing policy that needs to be created, as Tamil Nadu has done very thoughtfully, has to be done in a manner that women can access these opportunities. Either they have to be closer to clusters where a lot of families live so that, you know, they are able to physically access these opportunities, or they have to be safe transportation options that have to be provided to these women, or as Tamil Nadu has done very innovatively, create working women hostels. And even so, you have to really have experiments done with their families to ensure that, well, your women are safe, you know, once all of these facilities are provided of. But long story short, manufacturing facilities, and as Mr. Das was saying, bigger manufacturing facilities rather than small enterprises have a higher chance of offering safe employment, more formal employment to these more aspirational young women. Secondly, of course, there has to be enabling infrastructure, as I said, working women hostels or creche facilities. And incidentally, again, as the glass half full, this budget has announced, you know, conversion of a lot of Anganwadis in India for the next 5 years into creches, supporting voucher systems to be able to use existing creches for parents. And there is a draft sort of a national childcare policy on the cards, acknowledging that over 2/3 of women who don't work, you know, when they are asked in labor force surveys, why don't you work? Give childcare as the most important reason. So clearly that's something that needs to be worked on. But you can give them safety, you can give them jobs. Women also don't have networks. You do need to create a little bit of more labor intermediation services for them, be it through job fairs, be it through, you know, giving them more higher incentives for hiring and so on. Otherwise, unfortunately, you know, their development will lag behind that of women. The fourth thing is, once they are in jobs, there is an issue of retention as well, particularly once they enter motherhood. And there is evidence to show that companies which, not necessarily female directors, because now since we have a rule in India that every 1 out of 5 directors will be a woman, you do have fairly decent representation of 20% women. But that does not suffice. Having female managers is highly correlated with female and, you know, sensitive policies in terms of maternity breaks, in terms of flexible work options, in terms of allowing women to come back and giving them support once they become mothers. So retention. The fifth, as again Mr. Das was saying, like it or not, it will be a while to the time women actually enter salaried jobs, because salaried jobs are not even available for men right now. So they will be self-employed entrepreneurs in agriculture, in off enterprises, in any other small enterprise that they're from home. The World Bank in India, we did a study to understand how can these enterprises provide, you know, be suppliers to chains, to global chains, or even to public sector enterprises, where it at least actually has a mandate that 3% of all state-led procurement in India will be done from women's enterprises. We're not even able to meet 3%, we're at 1.5%. And the reason is that the government says, I don't know what these women do, where do they exist, which sectors, which states, which districts and blocks, and how do I connect to them? So they've got a portal called Udyam, but the women don't know how to register on Udyam. So there has to be an outreach to be able to understand what the lay of the land is and where are these women, what are they producing. So enterprises need to be focused on. The other sector that needs to be focused on is gig work and renewable energy. Those are two big sectors where Indian women are entering because of flexible work options, because of schemes that the government is providing. But unfortunately, again, there are no social protection mechanisms. There is no information on how do you become a solar entrepreneur or a solar sakhi, as women say, and as India really starts ramping up its investment in renewable energy. That's a big sector that women can enter into. The final 2 points I make are on the demographics, and referring back again to Professor Mehrotra's presentation. So point number 1 is, even amongst the youth, the window for women's employment is very small. As he was talking about women who are not in employment, education, or training, the NEET category, the statistic is that, when women are 18 years old, only about 25% of them, I say only, but that's also quite high, 25% of them are in NEET. Only 8.7% of boys are in NEET. They're moved on to employment, or training, or any other opportunity. When by the time girls become 23, 66% of them are in NEET. Why? Because they're more often than not married, and virtually all boys are in employment. So this is the window that we have. You have to catch women between 18 to 20, because once lost, they're lost forever. And the second point about demographics, which again, Professor Mehrotra was making, clearly the share of the elderly is going to increase. But given longevity of women, we tend to outlive men. We also tend to be without, at least in India, without assets in terms of land ownership, etc. So there is all evidence to suggest that the proportion of widows in India is going to explode. And we need to start thinking about social protection mechanisms, support mechanisms to these women who more likely, even without family supports. And as I said, I won't end on a picture of gloom, but hopefully I've given a lot of the positive steps before.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. And Anganwadis into creches, I thought that was a very good one. If you look at Bangladesh, of course, their female labor force participation rate has shot up because there's so many women employed in the textile sector. So points you're making about more employment in manufacturing, I think there's a resonance there. Now, I'm going to give Santosh 2 minutes to react if he wants to. In the meantime, if those of you who are online and have questions, please send them into the question box, right? And we're monitoring those, and we will take those up and then come back to the panel for responses. If you have a specific question for a specific person, you can mention that as well. If it's a more general question, then I will let the panel answer them more generally as well. But over to you, Santosh. If you have any reactions.
Indeed, absolutely.
I think there's a lot of resonance here.
But totally. The good news is that both Gurcharan and Soumya were saying things which are very similar, but let me just elaborate slightly. Let me begin with Soumya briefly. You see, on the female LFPR, you see, the problem is that which is not sufficiently well known, is that the girls, they've all gotten better educated, but they're not doing domestic chores. They're doing work mostly in agriculture, which is unpaid family labor. And that is where the problem, there's an increase in the last 4 or 5 years of 50 million in the category of unpaid family labor. And that's what's showing up in LFPR rising, WPR rising, and unemployment rate falling. The second thing about this is that these are all girls who've gotten better educated. They don't want to be in agriculture like their mothers. They have to get out of there. Because we know from Golden's work that there is a U-shaped curve in relation to per capita, relationship between per capita income on the one hand and female LFPR. It's high when a society is agrarian, it tends to drop, and as girls get better educated, then tends to rise. We are in the trough, and we are caught there, and we are doing precious little about it. And there is a definitional issue here. You see, PLFS, our labor force statistics, is not compliant with the ILO definition of employment. ILO does not define unpaid family labor as employment, defines it as work, but not as employment. And the government is simply sort of claiming that a lot of employment is being needed. I made a massive hullabaloo about this when I was a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics. It's absolutely critical that they have to change their definitions. And there's no question that non-farm jobs need to grow. And unless that happens, we will not have more jobs for them. Let me turn to Dr. Das. You see, I think he has great hope in PLI and ELI. Let me make 5 quick points about both, and then I'll stop there. One, let's remember that the Apple and Samsung cases, actually, the good examples that he quoted, they all began before PLI. So we didn't need PLI in order to get, of course, they've been benefited recently. We don't necessarily need PLI, point one. Point two, subsidies. Are we going to go back to the license permit Raj approach of subsidizing simply because our logistics costs are poor? You see, who's deciding on whether these subsidies are appropriate? We are picking winners. We're not only picking the sector, we're picking winner firms. And our bureaucrats best to decide this. I think the 50-year experience of license permit Raj has proven that. Thirdly, PLI, 12 of the 14 sectors are capital intensive sectors. Only 2 were labor intensive, and even when these labor intensive sectors have been chosen, the other problems I am talking about still remain. There's already a fear that after 4 or 5 years, when these subsidies end, the companies will ask for extensions. So never ending. The same problem with the license permit, right? The strategy I'm suggesting is not this vertical industrial policy. I'm suggesting a horizontal industrial policy, it's not true that the large firms create the jobs. No, it is the MSMEs, especially in the registered sector, which create the jobs. Unfortunately, our current problem with the MSMEs is the following, that there are only, of all MSMEs, and I've done this work demonstrated in the separate paper, that only 12% of all our MSMEs are ancillaries and are subcontracted to supply to larger companies. That's why I'm recommending a cluster development approach where you provide the infrastructure, the skills at the 5,500 manufacturing clusters in the country that exist. And if we did that, like China and Italy, then it will be a different story. Unfortunately, our government's approach is promote national champions, the 5 big points. That's not the way forward. When we created jobs from 2004 to 14, last sentence, we were allowing the regional bourgeoisie to grow. We can't rely simply on 5 large corporates or the next 5 large corporates to enable the creation of jobs that we need.
Yeah, thank you, Santosh. I will have to now come back to Gurcharan, because you have now raised a debate here. But let me do that with and add to it a question that has come online, Gurcharan, which is, and you mentioned that the PLI scheme is justified because the cost structure in India is not as good as in China or in Vietnam, etc. But of course, the question is, how long can this subsidy be? And what are the factors that create that cost disadvantage? And would the government be urged to also address those issues while providing some form of a temporary subsidy. So let me come back to you, Gurcharan, and give you some time to answer some of these. Thank you.
Right. Well, one is a matter of fact that I did a deep dive into the Apple case study. I
That's
talked
right.
to people in Cupertino, I talked to people in Delhi, and I talked to the people who negotiated finally. It was, in fact, the matter of fact is it was the first PLI, and it should have been the model for all PLIs because specifically Apple was pointing out that the cost disabilities that there was a lot of pressure on Apple to give the thing to Vietnam because they had good experience in Vietnam, and so to persuade them not to give the manufacturing of the phone to Vietnam, all they did was to correct some of the disabilities, which were for a period of time. The PLI is not forever. It's for a period of time. And also they recognize that after that period of time was over, that tariffs will rise. Now, it's not written in the contract. I would write that in the contract as I suggested. So what I'm saying is there is a right way and there's a wrong way. If you have the top global manufacturers of labor intensive products, and if you can swing it with a short term PLI by giving, say, Nike for shoes, and you can get a big Nike manufacturing operation going on in India. That would be, I still think, the right way to use it. I personally feel that it was not, the PLI was not to create national champions, as Santosh keeps telling. Apple is not a national champion, and Nike would not be a national champion. And almost all the global leaders are not national champions. So let's take that word out of our vocabulary and do the PLI in the way that it was done in the case of the Apple i16, the phone. The other thing that I did not mention was that, yes, domestically also, there is a possibility of a, job creation. I didn't want to completely dismiss it. The other piece of good news that we have in India, and that Santosh did not mention it, is the fact that we are living in an age of startups. There are over 100 unicorns that are there. And there was a study done by an MIT professor in the late 1980s or something like that. Possibly 19. It was a 25-year study which showed that the jobs in the American economy were not created by the big companies like Exxon and IBM. They were not created by the mom and pop stores either. They were created by the startups who actually went rapidly, became big. And such as at that time, the examples were FedEx, DHL, etc., because the courier companies came up at that time in the 80s. My point here is that is the other way that India, that hope, that glass of water half full that I talk about, is another way that it can be done. But reality is, it's not going to be done by the MSMEs. MSMEs will become suppliers to these rapidly growing companies. So this idea that on their own MSMEs create jobs just because you're in a cluster because you become a supplier. to another company, that's a cluster. Anyway, that's what I
Thank you.
wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. I have also a question on whether labor laws, land laws, all these factors are affecting job growth. But let me first ask Shekhar to ask his question.
Thank you, Ajay.
Shekhar Shah.
And it's great to be with Gurcharan and of course Santosh and Soumya. My questions all relate to the fact that India needs non-farm jobs. And we've seen that in the amazing reversal or stalling of structural transformation with employment in agriculture going up, which is completely unknown to development economists, let's say, in developed countries. So the first question is about the paradox of there not being enough good jobs and not enough good workers. And we see this paradox all the time. And that leads to the second question of what's wrong with India's skilling infrastructure, whether it's acquiring skills, whether it's matching skills to the jobs that are needed, or even most importantly in today's age, anticipating the skills that are going to be required. And the third question then, which is much more specific, relates to why are there so many young in this category of not employed, educated, or in training? What are they doing? Are they waiting for public sector jobs, giving these entrance exams again and again and again in a kind of rotating way? And what are the life chances for these people? So it'd be interesting to hear comments from the panelists on this.
Yeah, I think, Gurcharan, of course, you already addressed this to some extent, but let me give the entire panel a chance to come at this set of issues and also to answer this issue of question that has come up, which is how do labor laws affect growth and employment, and also perhaps land restrictions, land use in India. India has the most abundant factor of production is labor, and the scarcest factor of production is land. It uses both of them very poorly. Any thoughts about that would also be very helpful. So let me go to Soumya first and then reverse the order here.
I'll switch off my video, I think. Is this audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I think to respond to Shekhar's point, there's definitely a skill mismatch. So there are, when for example, the World Bank has done this big investment in green hydrogen, and we did many consultations with private sector companies who were investing in green hydrogen, and they said, look, we want to hire these people, but where are the people? Who's going to install my electrolyzer? Who's going to put in the nuts here? I mean, that particular type of skill was missing. But to come to the second question, Shekhar, I think it's a question of both quantity and quality. Just today, I was looking at, this big state like Andhra Pradesh, where you think that, there would be a lot of vocational training programs that would have been run by the skilling PM Kaushal, and only 1% of youth have accessed it. Only 1% of youth in Andhra Pradesh. So it's really not really delivering in a way. And of course, the course modules are also not well with the times. That they are usual electrician, plumbers, but not really looking at new age industries. So I think that's a problem of quantity, quality, and then also definitely of placement. I don't think we have ever thought of a strategy on how ITIs, etc., will be aligned to the private sector or industrial areas. So we've never done any sort of geographical mapping of industry clusters and what might be the skills needed, and therefore have the ITIs in that area supply those skills. We've never had a policy on that. And the third question on NEET, I think most boys, as I said, by 23 are in employment. It's really the girls. And by 18, 25% are really, we did a qualitative study, incidentally, Maitri and I, in Madhya Pradesh. And we found that they were all appearing for exams again and again, trying to acquire some skills. And about 2 or 3 years later, they were married. And about 80% of them, it was the reverse. 80% or, almost all the boys were at least employed and all the women were married. So that's what we found through the qualitative work.
Thank you. Gurcharan?
Well, I mean, I totally agree that we need reform of the land laws as well as the land acquisition laws as well as labor. And in fact, the labor codes this government tried to introduce was not the answer either, because they were raising the number of people who would qualify up to 300 in an enterprise, and from 100 to 300. But still, if you want large factories, this was of no use. So you're absolutely right, and but I don't know the last time the opposition jumped on the government because it was very badly handled. This government is not a persuasive government. They don't like to persuade people. you know, the lesson from Margaret Thatcher that I keep giving is that she used to say, I spend 20% of my time reforming and 80% selling the reform. Selling meaning to her own party, selling means to the bureaucracy, selling means to the general public. And of course, she did move the needle because that's what made uh, new labor possible after her. But what I'm trying to say is that I wish I could be more hopeful that we would get these reforms done. And as regards the skilling part of it, I would just say that yes, obviously, Shekhar is right that I went to, by the way, I went to high school in America, and we had a class called shop in Theodore Roosevelt High School in Washington, D.C., where I went to school. And in shop, we learned how to fix a radio, we learned how to repair a table that was broken. We learned those kinds of skills. And that would be a great thing for our schools to have. But the point that I'm making is the failure of our skilling and the ITIs and all these things is that it should always be demand led. Supply should always be demand led, and there was no connection. And that's why I'm a big enthusiast of apprentice schemes and internship schemes. Um, I myself was a product in Procter and Gamble of an internship program, so I know that the power of such programs, and that's a one way to link immediately your skilling with a plus. It gives the company 3 months to do an interview, a 3 month interview that it gives you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. So 1 minute, last word to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ajay, for bringing up the land and labor law issue. I couldn't agree with you more. It's part of my set of components for industrial policy, actually. Couldn't discuss it for shortage of time. Let me just say on the land issue, ultimately, let's remember that land is a state subject. And that is part of the problem, because often in the states, the political power rests with a huge number of MLAs who actually come from rural areas. And here too, I think we must remember, Ajay, that there is a north and south divide. The southern states have actually been able to handle this land issue effectively. Because I've been in discussion with the Tamil Nadu government, Andhra government, and in many ways they've solved problems on the ground where it needed to be done. For instance, in the acquisition of land for that Vizag-Chennai corridor, you had massive problems with the JICA-funded, Delhi to Calcutta, Delhi to Mumbai corridor, massive. So ultimately, this is not a central subject because of the Indian constitutions. On the labor issue, this is a concurrent subject. Becomes like, because in other words, not only the state, but also the center, they can both legislate. It's a very good thing that the central government has finally collapsed 35 labor laws into 4 codes. I was involved in the formulation of some of them. You see, the big concern here of workers, and that's why they oppose it, and I think we have to listen to them, very important, that, look, the Industrial Disputes Act, the 300 threshold issue was already resolved. The workers said that, look, we fully understand that companies need to take on people for a limited period, but those who are permanent workers, please give us 6 weeks remuneration for each year work, not 2 weeks remuneration for each year work when you dismiss us. This was agreed, but this was not taken care of. Well, finally, on the skills, I agree with Shikhar and Gurcharan. In the government, there are three problems, very, very quickly. One, the approach is we have not involved industry. It's as a result, it's remained supply driven. It is not demand driven. Wherever it has succeeded, it is demand driven. And it becomes demand driven when you actually bring industry in there. And Gurcharan is absolutely right. I'm also a great proponent of the right to apprenticeship. We have the Act 1961. I proposed this to the Congress Party, and they've actually accepted it as a right. So it's already been proposed. There's just no question about it. All this I write about in a book called India Skills Challenge.
Thank you so much, Santosh. Thank you. Thank you so much to the panel. This has been a very rich discussion. And I certainly have learned a lot. I am more with Gurcharan that the collapsing those laws into 4 codes was really, more window decoration rather than real reform. I do feel competitive federalism is the answer to, some states go ahead and do it, then others will have to follow. That is probably the way to go. I remain very hopeful that India will not be stuck in a middle income trap. I'm sorry, I'm not that pessimistic yet, because all these suggestions that you all have made, if they were taken up, then we would not be in a middle income trap. I do worry sometimes, of course, because I remember a graph in the UNDP Human Development Report of 2012, which showed Arab countries huge improvement in education and no jobs. And that led to the Arab Spring, so to speak, or the Arab uprising. I hope that kind of social problem doesn't come to India. But I think your consensus is very clear that without manufacturing-led growth, we will not solve the jobs crisis. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.